Today I'm reviewing Agatha Christie's The ABC Murders. ABC refers to not only the railway guide that would have been used for people in England, but also the initials of a possible serial killer and the MO of that serial killer, namely choosing victims by the letters of the alphabet, and also placing next to the body a copy of the ABC Railway Guide. The first victim is Mrs. Asher, and she lived in the town of Andover. That's followed by the strangulation of Betty Barnard on the beach at Bexhill. And then for C, the murderer chooses as his victim Sir Carmichael Clark in the town of Churston, and he's hit over the head while he's on his walk. The fourth murder takes place in the town of Doncaster, but the murderer gets the wrong person. He actually gets a person whose last name begins with an E, and that's one of the first few mistakes he makes. The ABC Murders contains a number of firsts for Christie. First of all, it's the first novel of hers that deals with a supposed serial killer. And it definitely draws a lot on this whole kind of Jack the Ripper atmosphere, where you've got the police and Poirot and Hastings, who is back again on this mystery, discussing the psychology and what is it that causes this madman to act as he does, and what are the links between the murders, and what kind of mania drives this man. Another interesting aspect to this is the fact that before each murder, Poirot receives a letter from the murderer telling him what town the murder is going to be in, and it's kind of a cat and mouse game. So we have this sort of goading on of Poirot, and for one of the first times in Christie's novels, we see things from the perspective of the number one suspect, a character whose initials are ABC. His first name is Alexander, his middle name is Bonaparte. His last name is Cust. So we have someone with a first and middle name of two great figures, Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte, and then this rather plain last name of Cust. He's an odd little man, and he kind of blends in and fits into the woodwork. He doesn't at all live up to these names. In other words, he's basically what the FBI would think of as the perfect profile of a serial killer. Another significant first in this novel, I felt, was that the first murder, the murder of Mrs. Asher, brings Christie down out of this upper crust, upper middle class to upper class echelon of British society to working class England. Mrs. Asher runs a shop. Her husband's an alcoholic who beats her. She has a poor niece who gets involved in the investigation of the crime. The whole thing is very, it has a very kind of seedy atmosphere, the first few chapters. And for that reason, it does not capture the public's interest the way that the second and third murder do. In the second murder, we have a waitress, but she comes from probably a more straight middle-class family. And the third murder involves a person, a titled individual from the upper class, who's killed on his estate. And of course, then we have the pattern of the idea of a serial killer. So then it starts to capture the attention of the British public. Another first for a Poirot Hastings novel is the fact that while Hastings does narrate the bulk of the novel, there are several chapters that are titled Not Narrated by Captain Hastings. These are usually the chapters that refer to either scenes with the police and the investigators where Poirot and Hastings are not present, or scenes with Mr. Alexander Bonaparte Cust and the people who kind of surround him in his dingy little flat. Once again, we get more insight into Poirot's method of gathering information and finding out what he needs to find out. Of course, he's always talking about using his little gray cells, whereas Hastings is always the man of action who wants to do things. But here's a passage from the book that becomes interesting because it's going to play out in many other subsequent novels. Poirot is talking about the possibility of meeting this Alexander Bonaparte Cust, and he's talking to Hastings, and he says, "We will talk. Hastings, there is nothing so dangerous for anyone who has something to hide as conversation. Speech, so a wise old Frenchman said to me once, is an invention of man's to prevent him from thinking. It is also an infallible means of discovering that which he wishes to hide. A human being, Hastings, cannot resist the opportunity to reveal himself and express his personality, which conversation gives him. Every time he will give himself away." So here we have Poirot just almost acting as a psychologist, engaging in conversations. And you'll find that in some of the Marple novels, Miss Marple gathers information in quite the same way. Let people talk, and they'll start talking about themselves. Again, another idea about the idea of a serial killer is that serial killers writing letters to the press, or to, in this case, Poirot, are trying to, and even by the act of murder itself, trying to assert personality. And so there's a lot of discussion about the sort of person who does this, who's kind of a loser, a nobody in society, but is able to gain some kind of notoriety, some kind of recognition by the murders that they commit. Now, the narrative voice doesn't seem to change all that much. You do, even though this isn't something that Hastings has witnessed, you get the sense that Hastings has kind of overseen the whole collection of this case into novel form, in much the same way that Watson would chronicle Sherlock Holmes's case. The ABC Murders is probably one of my favorite books of Christie's, certainly one of my favorite Poirot novels to date of the ones that I've read chronologically. I give it a 5 out of 5, no question about it. It's a very solid novel. It's written confidently, and you've got that wonderful sort of denouement at the end where Poirot gathers everyone together and reveals who the murderer is. It's quite a surprise, and I highly recommend it.